Now I'd like to introduce Steven Joyce. Steven served as a senior economic minister in the recent John Key-led national government in New Zealand. Over 9 years in cabinet, he held the portfolios of finance, economic development, science and innovation, transport and ICT. Steven also spent 7 years as Minister of Tertiary Education, Skills and Employment. He led the key government's economic growth program, the ultra-fast broadband rollout, and the country's largest highway building program in decades. Steven was also the campaign chief for the National Party for 5 national elections. Prior to entering politics, he was a successful radio entrepreneur, starting his first station, Energy FM in New Plymouth, and building it up to become the listed public company, Radio Works Limited, New Zealand's second largest radio company. Steven provides strategic policy and commercial advice to clients across Australia and New Zealand. He wrote the recent Strengthening Skills report on vocational education reform for the Australian federal government and chairs an expert panel to advise on the implementation of those reforms. So please welcome Steven Joyce.
Thanks very much, Rob. Ironically, given that I was the Minister of ICT that set up the ultra-fast broadband program, there's a slight possibility that my broadband will fall out this afternoon because I am outside the coverage area. I'm in the rural broadband area. So it just goes to show that ministers don't actually feather their own nests in terms of getting their own houses hooked up to broadband first. I think we'll be almost the last. Look, I'm conscious it's a really difficult time for many people, and one of the reasons you'll be sitting here on a Thursday afternoon is wondering what the hell's going to happen next. I can make a few observations, but ultimately it's changing daily. I've made some observations publicly previously. I think there's a lot more to do, and I'll lay out a little bit of that over the next 10 or 15 minutes. My background, as Rob mentioned, I started my own radio company. What he didn't say, and probably because I didn't share it with him, is that we started our radio company in October 1987, which was right November 1987, right after the October stock market crash of 87. And we used to say that, well, we know how bad it was at the start, so things could only generally thinking this could be the time, or at least shortly could be the time to get started. And they're probably right. Of course, that's not as exciting for those that are already in business and face the commitments. Sorry, my apologies. Hopefully you can hear me now. Let's have a look. It says I'm unmuted, so I hope we're all good. So the good news, of course, is that the case numbers are coming down pretty fast, which is great. To me, that really means we should be out after 4 weeks, and I think everybody who's trying to run a business should be pressuring the government to let them know as soon as possible. I see the number, it looks like we're going to know on the 20th of April. I would argue that ideally we should know a little bit before that, on the basis of all things being equal. And if that is, of course, we won't be going straight back to normal. We'll be going to either level 3 or some sort of hybrid level 3. And for example, there's talk that the schools will still be out at that time, and that's problematic for parents that are working and are also trying to get their kids through school. And also, what's interesting about it, of course, is it's not on the level 3 list. So I think there's an element of making this thing up as we go along, which we'd expect. But we also need some clarity. And I'd be hoping, for example, shortly, Prime Minister's talking about next week, that businesses should know whether they're going to be able to open after the end of the lockdown. As I say, there will be a debate. Interestingly, Australia's trajectory now is following a very similar trajectory to New Zealand in terms of cases, and they have actually kept their businesses largely going, not the hospitality sector, not the tourism sector, but normal manufacturers, retailers are still operating in some form. And I'd like to think we could get to that position safely as quickly as possible. Because I do think the economic consequences of this is still probably, not to be pouring too much cold water on a Thursday afternoon, but I think still massively problematic. We saw the Auckland Chamber of Commerce come out this week and say roughly a third of small businesses don't think they'll be around. And I think a lot of people unfortunately don't understand that when a business loses 100% of its turnover, it literally has nowhere to go. If you work on a margin of sort of 10% or 5% or something like that in a small business month to month, then a loss of 100% of turnover really does create massive issues. And somebody from a family of small business in the background, I mean, I just can't believe how challenging that will be right now for those of you with small businesses and in that situation. So I think absolutely speak up and put the pressure on your parliamentary representation to make sure they know where you're at and what you need. I think the business support has probably not been generous enough. It's quite consistent with Kaikoura and Christchurch, but I think arguably, and it was good that it was early, but I think arguably it should be more by now. It should be around the fixed costs of the businesses as well. And it's good to see the banks come to the party, but don't forget they are offering more debt. 80% of that debt's government guaranteed, sure, but for the person who holds the debt, it doesn't change it. It's still got to be paid back. So I'd be take advice as to whether that's the right thing to do. Now, some people have said, oh, well, small businesses should hang on in there, and in fact, larger businesses should hang on in there. And some politicians have said that. But only you can know what's the right thing for you to do. And if it makes more sense to pull the pin and start again, and that's the advice that you're getting from your own advisors, well, then I'd take that advice. But at the same time, if you can see your way through, if you can cut your cloth to fit and you can see a path out, then do take it, because there will be opportunities out the other side of this. It's just how much debt people take on in the meantime. So in terms of what happens next, I think we will come out reasonably soon. I think the political pressure will ensure we come out reasonably soon if the numbers of tested people with COVID-19 stays down. Of course, the border will be a problem for a while, and that's a huge problem for the tourism sector and the air transport sector and so on. And they're in an entirely unenviable position. Hospitality will be a while as well. But again, there are ways of doing this. And I think we've got to be careful that we don't automatically assume that we can't operate these businesses. For example, there's been talk starting that New Zealand could have a common border with Australia. It's something that I think really does need proper consideration. We are Australia's largest source of visitors alongside China, and Australia is our largest source of visitors. So if we shared a bubble, to use the terminology, then quite possibly we could be in a position where we can get our tourism industries going and some form of airline industry going again, which we will need to do. In terms of the changes and the things that won't change, I will say this: in my experience in Christchurch, and was that at the start, once the earthquakes, once the rebuild started, people had lots of grand visions about how the world was going to change. And the truth is that probably it changed a bit, but not as much as people think. And I think the same will apply here. There are some things that undoubtedly will change. I think we have learnt through necessity that we can do much more online than we thought we could do previously. I think there'll be much more remote working, and those sorts of things that probably should have happened anyway will probably happen because there's been a reason for it to happen, and people that think, oh, well, actually that's worked out quite well. But for example, the discussion about how much we interact internationally with other countries. We have made huge growth and wealth for this country by trading with other countries. And it's been the story of our history, actually. Britain's farm back in the day, then when Britain joined the EU, we had to build up a whole lot of other markets, including through Asia. Without international trade in both services and goods, we would be a very poor country, full stop. So there's all sorts of people that say that countries won't want to trade, and yes, there'll be lots of political posturing in that regard, and I can understand that. But fundamentally, for people to maintain their standard of living or something approaching their standard of living, which includes the health services, the education services, and so on, we will have to do all these things. Now, we might have to change a bit in terms of the way we do them to manage the risk. But if you look, I think it's instructive to look at countries like Singapore, Hong Kong, and Korea that have been through this once, which was with SARS. And they were much better prepared this time. And unfortunately, the course of human history says that you learn from what happens. And so the rest of the world is sadly learning in a very hard manner some of the lessons that those countries learned through the SARS epidemic and applied them very well this time. And we will effectively end up doing the same thing next time. But as a small, remote country, we can't afford the world to take a protectionist stance, because if the world takes a protectionist stance, we lose. We're small, we're relatively isolated, we don't have a big domestic market. Sooner or later, we're going to have to get out there again and start championing the cause of free trade and open borders. And that's going to be tough because nobody wants to talk about that at this point in time. But actually, at some point, we will have to in order to be able to maintain our standard of living. So that's all in the future. I'm a bit worried that we'll get a sense that we're going out of this and we'll stay out. I think if I was in business now, I'd be planning to structure my business in a way that could cope with another 1 or 2 potential lockdowns. Not that you want them to happen, but I suspect this idea that we will get away scot-free is I think, it's a low probability scenario, even though we're doing okay so far. So I think if you come through this part of the cycle, okay, you've still got a plan for potential shutdowns. Again, certainly over this winter and into the sort of September, October period, I would have thought, before things start to really straighten up. Now, the other thing we've got to do, of course, is back the scientists and back the researchers. I mean, the brilliant thing is that the world is a far better place in terms of equipped to deal with these sorts of challenges than it was 100 years ago. The DNA of the virus was sequenced very quickly. There will be better treatments next month, the month after, and the month after that. And there will be a vaccine at some point, although I don't think we can necessarily wait for the vaccine. But there'll be testing procedures that improve. There'll be treatments that improve. And sooner or later, it will become just another thing. Right now, it's the hugest thing in the world. In the future, it will come down to size. And then the real worry is economically. We could talk about that forever, but I would argue that the government has to get a bit more in place now. The downside risks economically are pretty high at this point, and then we need to prepare ourselves for the fact that we'll be paying back quite a bit of debt for quite a period of time. But there's always opportunity. So if you're struggling and you're dealing with very difficult times, do reach out, talk to people you know, and try and get out and see the wood for the trees. I know it's very, very hard. Lots of people can theorize about this stuff, but until you've been in a situation where somebody whips your whole business out from under you, you really don't understand what it's all about. So keep strong. And keep reaching out to people that can offer you good advice. That's me, Rob. Thank you, Stephen.
Really appreciate that. Now let me just pull up some questions, and I'll do a couple for you, Stephen, if you're okay with that, and then I'll move on to other people. I think Mark's going to pull up all the others in the screen. One of the questions is, if you were still Minister of Finance, what would you be doing differently than what Grant Robertson is currently doing?
Well, I think I would have hopefully, I think we would have gone at a similar time for the initial wage subsidy. And I think they did benefit from the fact that that had happened in New Zealand before. The Australians took longer to get the wage subsidy in place, partly because they've never had to go there before. And it's not a good answer to anything, except it happens to be the best answer in these sorts of situations. And so I think that was the right move. I have to say, I don't think there's been enough movement since then. I don't think there's quite an understanding of just how hard some small businesses have got it, particularly, and reasonable sized businesses as well, particularly the non-wage costs of the operation. And I'm worried that a lot of people would have taken the big check from MSD in the first few weeks and thought, oh, well, that'll get me through a while, but they're now facing the very sharp end of that. So those things, I think, I would be looking very hard now at extra stimulus, particularly for the small business sector. And that might be increasing the size of the wage subsidy or something like that.
All right, thank you. Stephen, this is a question for you. If we look at New Zealand versus Australia, at present there are two massively different strategies in place. Australia is still functioning as it has, businesses open, operating, people buying and spending. According to them, they're seeing COVID-19 under control. We've chosen to close down completely. Basically you're losing 100% of your revenue, as you said. You have very few choices because of a restart. A restart will not see any benefits for months. So are we doing massive economic damage? Did we make the right choice?
I think we're definitely doing massive economic damage. I don't think anybody's doubting that. The question is whether it was the right step to take. And I think the pressure will come on in comparison with Australia because, and let's be clear, the Australians have not just continued on as normal. The hospitality sector in Australia is closed. There's been discouragement of people going outside, and they're talking about it for a longer period. There's a limit to how many people can meet in public. I think it's 2. So some aspects of it are the same, but they certainly haven't stopped businesses from operating for the most part. I think there will be a comparison, and I hope the government is watching Australia very closely because the figures in Australia are tending down. If I saw some data today which says that New Zealand's trajectory is almost identical to Queensland and Victoria, for example. New South Wales is worse, but then New South Wales has had the difficulties with the cruise ships, which, to be fair, they've taken on sort of on behalf of the whole of Australasia, because most of the cruises actually terminate, and the ones that go around New Zealand terminate in Sydney and start in Sydney. And so they've ended up carrying that can, if you like, for the rest of the two countries. So I do think that'll be something that is debated a lot post this. And I would argue that the government could still do more to get some businesses going now. And I would be talking about online merchandise. It's fine to have the Harvey Normans and Noel Lemmings, but with the greatest respect, they're not the small businesses. A friend of mine was saying this afternoon that they bought their perfume from Australia and it's arrived. Thanks very much. So ironically, it's far easier to buy goods and have them shipped over from Australia currently than it is to have them from New Zealand. And that just makes no sense to me, given the position the two countries are in.
All right, and look, one final question aimed at you, Stephen, as you've probably got the most experience in this, and please don't shoot the messenger. Why aren't we seeing a scale back in the public sector like we are in the private sector?
Well, it's a fair question. I mean, right now, the public sector is needed to be doing its job right now, and I think there'll be parts of the government sector which is under a real strain trying to do what they're trying to do, because they're trying to do a lot. But I think it is going to be a situation where that comes later. You won't be able to sustain the level of debt that New Zealand was going to have at the end of this as a percentage of our economy. If the economy is going to shrink, the debt's going to grow without there being changes, and the public sector is going to feel that later on. Just the timing is a bit different. I think that is a little bit tough actually at the moment too, is the debate about the importance of public health versus the economy is a little bit of a false debate. unfortunately, it's the people who are in more secure jobs. To some extent, they're often saying, "Oh, look, we'll get through this." And then there's a lot of other people that have faced, they're redundant and they are, or they've lost their business or about to lose their business. And we probably do need to hear a bit more from those people at this point, just to get that economic balance right as we get out of the lockdown. And that's not being super critical of anybody. I just want to see that voice. And if I can make one suggestion to people who are feeling that struggle today, I'd say go and talk to your member of parliament, ring them up on the telephone, tell them what it's actually like. Doesn't matter whether the Labor, Green, National Act, whatever, make sure they understand what's going on. Because I don't think that has got through as much as you'd hope. Now, having said that, we're making great progress with the virus, but we will be doing comparisons with other countries and other ways of doing things. I don't think anybody's arguing you would do nothing. It's just about how do you maximise the rescue of the economy at the same time.
Good advice. Thank you, Stephen. Appreciate it.